Imagine walking into a bank, ready to deposit millions, only to be turned away because of the color of your skin. That's exactly what happened to James Daniels, a successful Black entrepreneur, when he tried to make a $200 million deposit at Blue Ridge Bank. But what the prejudiced bank manager didn't know was that Mr. Daniels wasn't just any customer. He was the bank's largest investor. Watch as this incredible true story unfolds, revealing how one man's dignity in the face of discrimination led to a powerful lesson in judgment and respect. The early morning sun streamed through the windows of Blue Ridge Bank, casting a warm glow on the polished marble floor. Susan Marley, the newly appointed branch manager, straightened her blazer and took a deep breath. Today was her chance to prove herself, and she was determined to make a lasting impression. As the clock struck 9, the bank's doors swung open, and a flood of customers poured in. The once quiet lobby quickly filled with the hum of voices and the soft beeping of machines. Tellers greeted familiar faces with practiced smiles, while account managers ushered VIP clients into private rooms. Susan's eyes darted from one corner to another, taking in the diverse array of customers. A young couple excitedly discussed their first mortgage application. An elderly gentleman carefully counted out crisp bills for deposit. A harried businesswoman tapped her foot impatiently, glancing at her watch every few seconds. Despite the bustling atmosphere, Susan couldn't shake the nervous energy coursing through her veins. She knew that today she'd be dealing with some of the bank's most important clients. First impressions were everything in this business, and she was acutely aware that one misstep could tarnish her reputation before it even had a chance to shine. As she made her way to her office, Susan overheard snippets of conversation. "Did you see the new manager? I heard she's quite the go-getter. Let's see if she can handle the pressure." The weight of expectations settled heavily on her shoulders. Susan paused at her desk, fingers tracing the nameplate that proudly displayed her new title. She allowed herself a small smile before squaring her shoulders and heading back out to the main floor. Today was her day to show everyone what she was made of. As the morning wore on, Susan found herself constantly on the move. She smoothed over a misunderstanding at the foreign exchange desk, calmed an irate customer whose card had been declined, and even stepped in to help when one of the tellers called in sick. With each interaction, she felt her confidence growing. Just as Susan was beginning to feel like she had everything under control, the bank's atmosphere shifted subtly. A hush fell over the lobby, and she noticed several customers turning to look at the entrance. Curious, Susan followed their gaze. A middle-aged black man had just walked through the doors. His clothes were simple, worn jeans, a plain button-down shirt, and scuffed work boots. He moved with an unhurried grace, seemingly oblivious to the attention he was attracting. As the man made his way towards the teller line, Susan felt a strange mix of curiosity and apprehension. Something about his calm demeanor stood out in stark contrast to the usual Monday morning frenzy. Little did she know, this unassuming figure was about to turn her carefully managed world upside down. The man's eyes met Susan's for a brief moment, and she felt a jolt of recognition. Not because she knew him, but because she saw something in his gaze, a quiet dignity, a hint of amusement, and something else she couldn't quite place. As he took his place in line, Susan couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was going to be far from ordinary. Money talks, but sometimes it whispers. As the man in work boots made his way to Susan's counter, the hush in the bank lobby seemed to deepen. Little did anyone know, the next few minutes would reveal a truth about wealth, prejudice, and the power of a single transaction to change everything. The man approached Susan with a warm smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Good morning," he said, his voice rich and smooth. "I'd like to make a deposit, please." Susan nodded, her professional mask firmly in place. She'd seen all types in her years at the bank, and she prided herself on treating everyone equally. "Of course, sir. May I see your account information?" Susan asked, her fingers poised over the keyboard. The man handed over a crisp business card, and as Susan entered the details, her eyebrows furrowed slightly. The account was one she'd never seen before, a high-level VIP account reserved for the bank's most elite clients. Susan's eyes flicked from the computer screen to the man standing before her. His worn jeans and scuffed boots seemed at odds with the account type. She felt a twinge of skepticism creeping in, her body language subtly shifting. Her shoulders tensed, and she leaned back slightly, creating an unconscious barrier between herself and the customer. "I'm sorry, sir, but there seems to be some confusion," Susan said, her voice taking on a slightly condescending tone. "This account type is typically for our more substantial clients." She emphasized the word, her implication clear. The man's expression remained unchanged, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Susan's growing unease. "I assure you there's no confusion," he replied. "I'm here to make a rather large deposit." Susan's skepticism grew, her facial expressions betraying her disbelief. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes narrowed slightly. She was so focused on the disconnect between the man's appearance and his claimed account status that she failed to notice the subtle signs of his confidence and composure. As Susan processed the information, her implicit biases began to surface. Studies have shown that employees may unconsciously make assumptions about clients based on their appearance, leading to discriminatory practices. Susan's behavior was a textbook example of this phenomenon, her preconceived notions clouding her judgment and affecting her customer service. The tension in the air was palpable as Susan cleared her throat. "I see. And may I ask the amount you wish to deposit?" She tried to keep her voice neutral, but a hint of challenge crept in. The man leaned in slightly, his voice low but clear. $200 million. Susan's jaw dropped, her eyes widening in shock. She blinked rapidly, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. $200 million, the man repeated calmly, as if he were discussing the weather. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Susan struggled to process this information. Her face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and disbelief washing over her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. As the reality of the situation sank in, Susan's earlier skepticism gave way to a dawning horror. She had just treated one of the bank's most valuable clients with thinly veiled disdain. The implications of her actions began to unfold in her mind, each realization more devastating than the last. The man stood patiently, his quiet dignity a stark contrast to Susan's visible distress. As other customers began to take notice of the unfolding drama, Susan realized that this encounter was far from over. In fact, it was about to become the most important moment of her career, for all the wrong reasons. In a twist of fate, Susan's disbelief morphed into something far more dangerous. As tensions rose, the true cost of her assumptions was about to be revealed. What if the very person you wrongly accused held the power to change your entire future? Susan's face flushed a deep crimson as she struggled to regain her composure. The initial shock of the man's $200 million deposit claim quickly gave way to anger and suspicion. She leaned forward, her voice low and accusatory. "Sir, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but we take fraud very seriously at Blue Ridge Bank." The man's calm demeanor remained unchanged, a stark contrast to Susan's growing hostility. He reached into his pocket, producing another business card. "I understand your concerns," he said softly. "Perhaps this will help clarify things." But Susan was too far gone, her judgment clouded by preconceived notions and stereotypes. She waved away the card without even glancing at it. "I've seen enough," she snapped. "I don't know how you got access to this account information, but I can assure you, this scam ends now." As Susan's voice rose, other customers began to take notice. Heads turned, and a hush fell over the bank lobby. The man stood quietly, his dignity intact despite the humiliation being heaped upon him. Susan's behavior was a textbook example of how stereotypes can influence decision-making. Rather than considering the evidence before her, she clung to her initial assumptions based solely on the man's appearance. This kind of racial profiling in banks is unfortunately all too common, with studies showing that Black individuals are disproportionately targeted for suspicion of fraud or scams, regardless of their actual financial status. In fact, a 2021 study revealed that 47% of Black Americans reported experiencing racial discrimination in financial services. Susan's actions were not just unprofessional, they were part of a larger, systemic problem that continues to plague the banking industry. The tension in the air was palpable as Susan's accusations grew more heated. "I don't know who you think you are," she hissed, "but I can assure you, we don't serve your kind here." A collective gasp rippled through the lobby. Susan's words hung in the air, heavy with prejudice and ignorance. The man's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. Susan, oblivious to the shocked reactions around her, plowed on. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "If you don't, I'll be forced to call security." The man nodded slowly, a sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I see," he said quietly. "Well, I suppose we're done here then." As he turned to leave, the other customers in the bank stared in disbelief. Some shook their heads in disgust, while others whispered among themselves, clearly appalled by what they had just witnessed. Susan stood behind her counter, a triumphant smirk on her face. She was so caught up in her perceived victory that she failed to notice the tall man in a sharp suit who had just entered the bank. As he surveyed the scene before him, his eyes narrowed and a frown creased his brow. Little did Susan know her world was about to be turned upside down, and the consequences of her actions would reach far beyond this one encounter. As the dust settled on Susan's tirade, a new player entered the stage. Who was this mysterious figure in the sharp suit, and why did his presence send a chill down Susan's spine? The bank's atmosphere was about to shift dramatically, and with it, the balance of power. The tall man in the impeccable suit moved with purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He paused at the entrance, taking in the scene before him with keen interest. His eyes darted from Susan's flushed face to the calm demeanor of the man she had just berated. The tension in the air was palpable, and he could sense that something significant had transpired. As he approached, conversations hushed and heads turned. There was an air of authority about him that commanded attention without a single word being spoken. Susan, still riding high on her perceived victory, failed to notice his approach until he was standing right beside her counter. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was deep and steady, cutting through the silence like a knife. Susan jumped, startled by his sudden appearance. "Mr. Taylor, I didn't see you come in." Her confident demeanor crumbled instantly, replaced by a nervous smile. The man she had dismissed moments ago turned to face the newcomer, a hint of recognition in his eyes. Mr. Taylor nodded respectfully in his direction before turning back to Susan. "I couldn't help but overhear the end of your conversation," Mr. Taylor said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "Would you care to explain what's going on?" The atmosphere in the bank shifted dramatically. Customers who had been watching the confrontation with a mix of horror and fascination now held their breath, sensing that the tables were about to turn. Susan's face paled as she realized the precariousness of her situation. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The man she had accused stood quietly, watching the interaction with interest. Mr. Taylor's presence had completely altered the dynamics of the situation. His authority was evident in the way Susan scrambled to explain herself, her earlier bravado evaporating under his steady gaze. It was a stark reminder of how quickly social interactions can change when someone with perceived power enters the equation. As Susan stumbled through her explanation, Mr. Taylor's frown deepened. He turned to the man in the worn jeans and work boots, his expression softening. "Mr. Daniels, I apologize for any inconvenience. I assure you, this is not how we treat our valued clients at Blue Ridge Bank." The revelation hit Susan like a ton of bricks. Her eyes widened in shock as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. The man she had dismissed and insulted was not only a legitimate client, but one important enough to be on a first-name basis with a senior bank official. Mr. Taylor turned back to Susan, his expression now stern. "Susan, I think we need to have a serious discussion about bank policy and customer service. In my office now." As Mr. Taylor led Susan away, her face a mask of confusion and growing dread, The other customers in the bank began to whisper among themselves. The man, now identified as Mr. Daniels, watched the scene unfold with a quiet dignity, the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The events of the morning had taken an unexpected turn, and it was clear that Susan's world was about to be turned upside down. As she followed Mr. Taylor to his office, the weight of her actions began to settle on her shoulders, and the true cost of her prejudice was about to become painfully clear. Susan's panic dissolved into the chaos of her thoughts as Mr. Taylor led Mr. Daniels to a private office. The contrast between the two men was stark, Mr. Daniels' calm demeanor a sharp counterpoint to Susan's visible distress. As they walked, Mr. Daniels turned to Mr. Taylor with a gentle smile. "Robert, I appreciate your concern, but there's really no need for all this fuss. I'd prefer to keep things low-key if possible." Mr. Taylor nodded, though his furrowed brow betrayed his unease. "Of course, Mr. Daniels, but I must insist we address what happened. The way you were treated is completely unacceptable." As they settled into the plush chairs of the private office, Susan stood rooted to her spot in the lobby, her face a mask of shock and embarrassment. The other customers whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Susan and the closed office door. Inside, Mr. Daniels leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed despite the earlier confrontation. "Robert, I've faced discrimination before. It's unfortunate, but it's a reality many people of color deal with daily. What matters is how we respond to it." Mr. Taylor's eyes widened in admiration. Mr. Daniels' grace under pressure was a powerful reminder of the impact dignity can have in the face of injustice. It brought to mind other instances throughout history where individuals had faced discrimination with similar composure. "Your attitude is commendable, Mr. Daniels," Mr. Taylor said, "but surely you must want some form of recourse." Mr. Daniels shook his head. "Escalating the situation won't solve anything. What happened today is an opportunity, a chance for this bank to examine its practices and make real changes. That's far more valuable than any personal vindication." As Mr. Daniels spoke, the tension in the room slowly dissipated. His words carried a weight that went beyond the immediate situation, touching on deeper truths about human nature and the power of forgiveness. Outside, Susan paced nervously, her mind racing with possible outcomes. She imagined lawsuits, public scandals, her career in tatters. Yet inside the office, Mr. Daniels was advocating for a very different approach. "What I propose," Mr. Daniels continued, "is that we use this as a teachable moment. Implement better training programs, review hiring practices, perhaps even start a mentorship program for young people of color interested in finance." Mr. Taylor listened intently, his respect for Mr. Daniels growing with each passing moment. Here was a man who had every right to be angry, yet he chose to channel that energy into positive change. As their meeting drew to a close, Mr. Taylor stood, extending his hand. "Mr. Daniels, your response to this situation is truly inspiring. I promise you we will take your suggestions to heart and make real changes here at Blue Ridge Bank." Mr. Daniels shook his hand firmly. "That's all I ask, Robert. Now, shall we take care of that deposit?" As they exited the office, all eyes turned to them. The quiet dignity Mr. Daniels exuded was palpable, casting the earlier incident in a new light. Susan, still standing where they had left her, felt a mix of shame and awe wash over her. Mr. Taylor's expression was grave as he surveyed the lobby. It was clear that the events of the day would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Susan, but for the entire bank. As he prepared to address the situation, one thing was certain: the power of dignity had transformed a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for growth and change. Mr. Taylor's grave expression hinted at the storm about to break. In a world where words can destroy careers and shatter reputations, how would he navigate this minefield of discrimination and corporate policy? The bank lobby fell silent as Mr. Taylor cleared his throat. All eyes were on him, waiting to see how he would handle this delicate situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice firm and clear, "I want to address what just happened here. At Blue Ridge Bank, we pride ourselves on treating every client with respect, no matter who they are or how they dress. Susan stood frozen, her face pale as she realized the gravity of her actions. The other employees shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with their disgraced colleague. Customers whispered among themselves, their disapproval palpable in the tense atmosphere. Mr. Taylor continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. What we witnessed today was a gross violation of our core values. It's not just about losing a valuable client. It's about the fundamental respect we owe to every person who walks through our doors. As he spoke, the weight of accountability settled heavily on Susan's shoulders. In professional settings, actions have consequences, and hers were about to come crashing down. She could feel the disapproving stares of her coworkers, the silent judgment of the customers she had served for years. We cannot and will not tolerate discrimination in any form, Mr. Taylor declared. It goes against everything we stand for as an institution and as human beings. The tension in the room was unbearable as everyone waited for Mr. Taylor's next words. Susan's heart raced, her mind frantically searching for a way out of this nightmare she had created. Mr. Taylor turned to face Susan directly. His voice was low but clear, carrying across the silent lobby. Susan, your actions today have left me no choice. You're fired, effective immediately. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked shocked at the swiftness of the decision. Susan stood rooted to the spot, her world crumbling around her. As security escorted Susan out, Mr. Taylor addressed the remaining staff and customers. Let this be a lesson to all of us. Our actions have consequences, and we must always strive to treat others with dignity and respect, regardless of appearances. The incident at Blue Ridge Bank that day would have far-reaching consequences. As news spread, it sparked conversations about implicit bias and discrimination in the financial sector. The bank's swift action in firing Susan sent a clear message about their zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. In the days that followed, Blue Ridge Bank announced new training programs and initiatives to promote diversity and inclusion. The incident served as a wake-up call, not just for one institution, but for the entire industry. As the dust settled, Mr. Daniels' dignified response in the face of discrimination became a powerful example of grace under pressure. His choice to turn a negative experience into an opportunity for positive change resonated with many, inspiring others to stand up against prejudice in their own lives. The events of that day at Blue Ridge Bank would be remembered for years to come, a stark reminder that in the world of finance, and in life, character and integrity matter far more than appearances. As the dust settled from Susan's dramatic exit, Mr. Daniels stood at a crossroads. The bank that had moments ago dismissed him now eagerly awaited his business. But in this pivotal moment, would he choose retribution or rise above, potentially reshaping the future of Blue Ridge Bank in ways no one could have predicted? A wave of applause rippled through the bank lobby, startling Mr. Daniels. Customers and employees alike clapped, their faces a mix of approval and relief. The air crackled with a newfound energy, as if a great weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. Mr. Taylor turned to Mr. Daniels, a look of admiration in his eyes. Mr. Daniels, shall we proceed with your transaction now? Mr. Daniels nodded, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the tumultuous events. As they walked towards a private office, the contrast between his current treatment and the earlier dismissal was stark. Employees who had previously ignored him now smiled warmly, eager to catch his eye. Inside the office, Mr. Taylor closed the door, muffling the continued buzz from the lobby. Mr. Daniels, I can't apologize enough for what happened today. I assure you we'll be implementing immediate changes to prevent anything like this from happening again. Mr. Daniels settled into a plush leather chair, his weathered work boots a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. I appreciate that, Robert, but let's focus on the positive changes we can make moving forward. As they discussed the details of the transaction, the atmosphere in the bank continued to shift. Employees huddled in small groups, their whispered conversations a mix of shock at Susan's behavior and awe at Mr. Daniels' grace under pressure. One teller turned to her colleague, her voice low. "Can you believe it? We've been serving Mr. Daniels for years, and none of us ever knew who he really was." Her colleague shook his head. "It just goes to show you can't judge a book by its cover. I wonder how this will change things around here." Indeed, the incident was already having a ripple effect on the bank's culture. Employees who had previously been complacent about customer service now approached each interaction with renewed attention and respect. Back in the office, Mr. Taylor and Mr. Daniels were wrapping up their meeting. "Mr. Daniels, your deposit has been processed. Is there anything else we can do for you today?" Mr. Daniels stood, extending his hand. "No, thank you, Robert. I appreciate your handling of this situation. I look forward to seeing the positive changes we discussed implemented in the coming months." As they walked back into the lobby, all eyes turned to them. Mr. Daniels's quiet dignity was a powerful presence, a living reminder of the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of appearances. Mr. Taylor addressed the room one final time. "Thank you all for your patience today. Let this be a lesson to us all about the importance of respect, integrity, and humility in our interactions with others." As Mr. Daniels left the bank, the weight of the day's events settled over everyone present. They had witnessed more than just a dramatic confrontation. They had seen the power of dignity in action and the profound impact it could have on an entire organization. The story of what happened at Blue Ridge Bank that day would be told and retold, becoming a cornerstone of the bank's culture and a powerful reminder of the lasting impact a single interaction can have. It was a lesson in humility that none of them would soon forget. As the dust settled at Blue Ridge Bank, the events of that day left an indelible mark on everyone involved. Mr. Daniels's quiet dignity in the face of blatant discrimination had transformed a moment of prejudice into a powerful lesson. His response challenged deep-seated stereotypes about wealth and race, proving that true character isn't defined by appearances. The incident sparked crucial conversations about bias in the financial sector. It reminded us that maintaining composure in the face of injustice can be a catalyst for change. Mr. Daniels didn't just deposit money that day. He invested in a future where people are judged by their character, not their clothes. As we reflect on this story, it's worth examining our own biases. How often do we make snap judgments based on appearances? In a world where prejudice still lurks in unexpected places, Mr. Daniels's example shines as a beacon of hope and a call to action. His story reminds us that every interaction is an opportunity to challenge stereotypes and promote understanding.